Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Shevuot daf tevav. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of Tzela Gez and for the four shlema of her newborn son. Okay, we're going to get started with the bottom of Yud Dalet Amud Bet. What we're going to discuss today is the procession that would go with adding on to Jerusalem or adding on to the azara. So there was a whole ceremony that went along with it. Okay, we'll go look in the Mishnah for one quick minute. We had, why were we talking about this? Because we were trying to explain anyone who goes in when they're impure to the mikdash, right? That's all the yediyot tumah we've been talking about. What is considered mikdash? What is considered azara, right? So then they said, we're talking about even someone who goes into the tosefet azara, right? The part that was additionally added. If it was done, today we're going to learn in the proper manner, then that's still, right? So let's say there was an expansion done in the Beit HaMikdash, like for example, in the time of Herod. So if it was done in the proper way, then it was considered sanctified, and therefore, if somebody comes in impure to that area, they accidentally, right, depending on the situation, they would have to bring a korban, depending on which korban. So then it explained in the Mishnah, she'em mosifim ala ir v'ala zarodim at the bottom of your Dalet Amud Aleph right now, ela b'melech v'navi v'urim v'tumim v'sanhedrin shel shivim v'echad. I'm going to stop for a minute. Those are all learned out from the Torah. Need a king, which Moshe was considered the king at the time, has to be done the way it was done in the Mishkan, which is where we ended yesterday, which is where we learned it from there. So we'll go back to that in a minute. With the Urim V'Tumim, there has to be right a melech, king, a prophet, Urim V'Tumim, and the Sanhedrin of 71. Then we get to another list, which we'll deal with also today, which is the Shtei Todot, two Thanksgiving offerings, which we'll discuss what those are and what and why. The Shiur with song, what songs would they sing? We'll get back to that. What was the song list? Ubeidim ha'achim v'shtei todot acharihem, and then there's a procession, there's a walk. Sounds like the simple reading is first the Beit Din walks, then the two todot are behind, but we're going to see that's not exactly the case. And Kol Yisrael acharihem, and then behind them the rest of the people. Hapnimit ne'achelet achitzona nisrefet, and then we go back to those two Thanksgiving offerings. The inner one is eaten, the outer one is burned. We're going to end our daf with trying to figure out why one is eaten, one is burned, what's inner, what's outer. Okay, we'll get back to all that. So we start our daf with what we ended yesterday, which is Menahan and Mile. Where do we get the fact that going into the Tosefet Azara whatever is considered the Azara has to be done in this manner? Kohen, the Navi, the Melech, all those things. So we said because the pasuk in Shmot chapter 25 says and the way they understood, and this is how you should do it. This is how you should do it in the future. When's the future? Lidorol, right? For all future generations, has to be done in the way it was done at the time of the tabernacle. Mativ Rava. So the first thing is going to be about this b'chein tasu, which we understand to mean for future generations. Rava says, what about this source? This source seems to contradict. There's something called klei sharet in the Beit HaMikdash, and the way it works is, let's say I'm making a mincha offering. When I put the item into the klei sharet, that sanctifies it. Before it's in a klei sharet, it's not sanctified. So a klei sharet, which sanctifies things, which happens all the time in the temple, things are put in, right? The blood is put into a klei sharet. So all these things that we put in these sanctified temple vessels. All these temple vessels are sanctified. Now they have to go through a process to become sanctified. They're not just, snap your finger, we made a vessel. It's now sanctified. You have to do something. So in the time of Moshe, they would anoint all the vessels with oil. They would put oil on them, the Shemen HaMishcha. So all the ones that Moshe did, Meshichatam Makadashtan, and based on B'chein Tasu, what would you say for future generations also? Because if you notice in that pasuk, it says, Tavnit HaMishkan, right? The blueprints for the Mishkan, and Kol Kelav, and all the Kelim, which theoretically should include these as well. So every Kli that Moshe did, right, which by the way would include the big Kelim, like the altar and the Kior, right, the sink and the basin and all those things. Right? Not exactly a sink, it's a basin. Mikam va'elech, avodatam mechanachtan. But after that, and it's only with Moshe did they use the Shemen HaMishcha. After that, using it for the first time, that would sanctify it. So the first use would create the sanctification to the vessel. Now, why would that work? Nema v'chein tasu l'dorot. Why don't you say v'chein tasu is for future generations? Has to be done like Moshe did. Only with Shemin HaMishchach can it be sanctified. To which the Gemara answers, there's a special pasuk. What's the pasuk? Shanei hatam damarkra vayim shechem vayikadesh otam. It said Moshe anointed them and sanctified them. Now, what's the key word there? Them. Them means these and no others. Otam b'mishicha v'lo l'dorot b'mishicha. And that comes to say, only these needed mishicha. In future generations, they won't need that. Okay, so now they say, maybe you could have understood that differently. Maybe you could have understood, Ema otam b'mishicha, l'dorot o b'mishicha o b'avodah. Maybe what it meant is, the first vessels that Moshe consecrated, those are consecrated only with Mashiach. If you didn't do Mashiach, no way, no how. But in future generations, either use the Shemin HaMishcha or use the first use. Okay? And maybe it's an option for later. In other words, what Rabbi said is become an elech only working them, but why should that using them would consecrate them? But maybe, right? Maybe that if you're going by this drasha only, Otam could be saying these have their own unique way, which is only Mashiach. That could be done either or. So I'm Rav Papa. Okay, we're not going to say that. Rav Papa says for a different reason, because there's another pasuk which teaches you it's not either or for the future. There's another pasuk which references the future, and it's a pasuk in Bamidbar now. I'm Rav Papa. I'm Rav Krab. Ashir Yasher Tubam Bakodesh. Here it's talking about the Levites carrying all the vessels of the tabernacle. And it talks about the vessels, and it says, they took all the klei sharei, right? These vessels that were used in the temple, asher yishartu bam bakodesh, that they will serve with them in the kodesh, right? In the sanctified places. Now, notice what it says. Yishartu is future, so therefore they're going to assume this pasuk is referencing future generations. And it says kodesh, about sanctifying it. So, tila'ana katu b'sherut. Now, Shevuot and avodah are the same thing. Shevuot is to work, right? That they're going to work with them, serve in the temple. So now they're going to say, what does it mean, yishartu bam b'kodesh? In the future, they will turn them into kodesh by Shevuot, by working. So don't think it's, if you just had otam, you would have said the temple one, right? The first ones in the tabernacle were Mashiach. But the later ones could be either or, right? Because Otam says only these have something unique. This unique is only Mashiach. But comes the word Yishartu Bam B'Kodesh to teach you, no. The ones in the future are not going to be through Mashiach, only through Shevuot. So we have one pasuk which says only those through Mashiach, right? And not the later ones. And the second pasuk says only those, right? The future ones can only be done through service. That's how they become sanctified. So the Gemara now asks an obvious question, which is, well, if already from the last pasuk we just saw, Asher Shatu, there's a very circular kind of sugya. If you say Asher Shatu, which means, right, we're talking about the future ones, and the future ones need to be done by avoda, then I don't need otam anymore, right? If the Torah tells us that in the tabernacle, they use the Shemin HaMishcha. And we have this pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar, which indicates that in the future, through avoda, right, through working them, through using them, they're going to be consecrated. So I don't need a special pasuk by the Mashiach, by the anointing, to say specifically only in that time where they anointed, not later, because we already have the pasuk in Bamidbar, which says they were consecrated by, right, they will be consecrated in the future only by working. So why do we need both pasukim, right? Gemara says, wait, ilo kata brachmana la otam. Without the word otam, you could have read Asher Shatubam differently. You could have thought Havamina. I would have thought Hani Hudim Mashicha. Okay, the original ones are Mashicha only. Lidorat b'Mashicha u b'avoda. But maybe the future ones need both. Asher Shatubam teaches you need to work them, but from the previous, if I didn't have otam, what would I have said? Dehaktiv v'chein ta'asu. Remember, it says v'chein ta'asu. So what would I have thought? V'chein ta'asu teaches me I have to do it exactly the way it was done then. I need to do Mashiach. Asher Shatu teaches me I have to do it ba'avoda. So what would I conclude if I didn't have otam, the limiting pasuk? I would have said it needs both Mashiach and avoda, right? Pasuk Shmot Perek Kafei tells me Mashiach. Bamidbar, I think it's chapter 5 or chapter 4, okay, verse 12. Yishar Tubam teaches me avoda. I might have thought both. Okay, so I just want to, like, it's a little confusing because at some point we suggested either or, and now we're suggesting perhaps it's both. And that's why you need otam to tell you, no, 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 only these b'mashicha. Get rid of mashicha on your list. And what are you left with? Just avoda. And that's why we need both, right? We start off v'chein tasu. V'chein tasu is not relevant here because of the two drashot. Otam means only those b'mashicha, and yashir shatu means the later ones only avoda. And you need them both because otherwise you might have thought, again, one might have led you to think either or, and one might have led you to think both. So in the end, you have both those drashot that work together to teach you exactly what the halacha is. Okay, from there, we're done with that first confusing sugya, which was how do we deal, and this was all just from a question of Rava, if we take b'chein tasu literally. Now, we're totally off topic because we weren't talking about klei sharet. We were talking about adding to Jerusalem and adding to the azara. And the whole thing that we took it from was, the way God showed, right, the Mishkan, how the Mishkan was consecrated, that's how the temple is going to be consecrated. And therefore, right, b'chein tasu, everything has to be done in the same way. And that's how we got to our big question, which is, wait, everything has to be done in the same way. Why, in this totally side issue, why are the klei sharet not sanctified in the same way? And for that, we had those two drashot. Okay, getting back to our topic. Ub'shtei todot. Now we go to the shtei todot. The two korbanot todah. Now, a Thanksgiving offering, just to review, Thanksgiving offering was an offering, it was actually an animal sacrifice. You bring an animal, and then with it would come these 40 loaves of meal offering, like a kind of meal or a bread offering, okay, made of, and it was the 40 loaves were made of flour and water. The 40 loaves were made in a unique way, okay? Now, in general, the mincha offerings in the temple were not chametz, right? You're not allowed to bring chametz onto the altar at all. However, there's two exceptions to the rule, and we're going to talk about them both today. One is there were 10 of the 40 loaves that you would bring with the Thanksgiving offering that were chametz, okay, which actually we're going to learn today was made from half of the batter, okay? So even though there's 40 loaves, you took half of it and you put it toward the chametz ones. And then, okay, so I didn't say yet. So, no, I did say 10 of the 40 loaves. However, they were made up with half of the batter, went to make these 10 chametz loaves. And the other half of the batter was divided into three. There were three types, which we'll talk about today, the three types, but they're all matzah type offerings. None of them were leavened. Okay. So now we're going to learn b'shtei todot. Now, shtei todot could be two animals that are todah sacrifices, or it could be two loaves from the todah sacrifice, and then which of the loaves. So we don't know what it is. So now we bring a braita, Tana, right from our Mishnah. It's not clear. The braita says, "Shtei todot shamru b'lachman v'lo b'bsaran." It's the bread and not the meat. Okay, so first of all, we're getting rid of the meat. Now, how do we know? And we're going to learn in a minute that it was also the chametz ones. Well, where do we know in general about this ceremony? So we had the v'chein tasu. Okay, so we're going to say somehow, right? Adding on to this, the azara, and adding on to Jerusalem is done somewhat like, was done in the Mishkan, and that's how we got the Urim B'tumim and all that. And that's why I divided the issues, right? There's the Urim B'tumim, the Navi, the Melech, the Sanhedrin. Okay, that we can all get from the time of Moshe. But the second part of the Lachmei Todah, the Beitim walking and all that, we're going to learn from a chapter in Nechemia. When they consecrated Jerusalem, when they came back to Jerusalem and then they built the wall around the city, and then they consecrated, they had a big ceremony. And that ceremony, I recommend you read it. It's described in chapter 12 of Nechemia. And there it says, and that's where we're going to learn all these other things. Amar Rav Chisda Amar Kra, va'amida shtei todot gedolot. So I put up, he describes, two big todot. Okay, we're going to have to deal with this word big. What does it mean, big? V'taluchot liyamim me'al hachoma. Okay, and there were processions on the right, on top of the wall. My gedolot. So what does it mean, todot gedolot? So again, it could be animals, it could be bread. We already know it's bread, but now we have to figure out why. Ilema mimin gadol mamash nema parim. if you want to say it was big animals, right? There's always big animals and small animals. The big animals are the cattle, the small animals are the sheep and the lambs and all that. So it should have just said parim, right? Bull, cow offerings. Ela gdolot biminan. It could be gdolot, large in type. Okay, it could be like if you're going to take a sheep, a larger sheep. If you're going to take a bull, a larger bull. Maybe that's what it means. But God doesn't care if you bring a large or small. There would be no value to bring a larger bull than a smaller bull. How do we know this? It says in the Braita. Right? If you bring a voluntary burnt offering of an animal, it says ishareach nichach. That means, right, that it will be a reach nichach, a beautiful smell for God, right? God will accept it. Olat ha'ov ishareach nichach. Bimincha ishareach nichach. Okay, whether you bring an animal, a bird, which is obviously smaller than an animal, or a meal offering, which is obviously less significant, it costs a lot less money, right? Apropos our sliding scale offering we've been talking about. If you bring any of those as voluntary offerings to God, God called them all the same thing, ishareach nichach. What does the Braita learn from here? It doesn't matter if you bring a lot or a little, right? If you're wealthy and you can bring the nicest sacrifice in the world, or you're not so wealthy and you can bring something basic and small. All that matters is what your intention is. Okay, as long as you're mechaben libo laviv shebashamayim, you have intent to bring a sacrifice to God. That's all that matters. So there would be no reason to bring a larger animal. It makes no sense. So what does large mean then? What are we talking about? Ela gdola shebatoda. They mean the larger part of the Todah offering. Now, as I explained to you, if you talk about the breads, okay, now they're going to move from, it's obviously not talking about the animal. There is no large and small by animals that would be significant. It must be talking about the meal offering, the breads that went with it, the loaves. And it must be talking about the larger of the loaves. What is that? As we already know, okay, my nihu chametz, that's the chametz ones. So this procession was done with chametz loaves of bread, like the Thanksgiving ones. So we take 2 Thanksgiving breads that are chametz ones. How do we know that the chametz ones were bigger? As I described, and now we're going to see it inside, and we'll get into all the measurements. Ditna. התודה התבעה מן 5 שאים ירושלמיות, שהם 6 מדבריות. Okay, we've had some sugyot to talk about this. The measurements changed over time. In the desert, meaning what was written in the Torah, the measurements were sometimes a little different than the ones nowadays, in their time nowadays. So what's called a se'ah Yerushalmi, it would have been 5 in that measurement, but 6 in the ones in the midbar, because the midbar portions were small. Now, if we talk about the midbar portions, shehem shtei ephot. Why? How do we get the fact that it's 2 ephot? That's another measurement. Ha'ephah shalosh se'im, okay? Because each ephah is 3 se'ah, so 6, okay, this is simple math. 6 se'im is then 2 ephot. Now, esrim isaron. In isaron is a tenth of what? A tenth of an ephah. Right? We talk about this all the time when you say musaf, right? You can pay attention tomorrow, right? Isaron. Isaron describes the nesachim, the libations, how a tenth of, right? The meal is a tenth of the dough, what is a tenth? A tenth is a tenth of an ephah. Okay, and ephah is this measurement of se'im, okay, 3 se'im, so it's a tenth of 3 se'im. So now, obviously, if there's 2 ephot, and the tenths are a tenth of an ephah, how many tenths are in there? Okay, if it was 1 ephah, there would be 10 tenths. 2 ephot, 20 tenths. Okay, it sounds like complicated math, it's very simple math, right? We're talking very simple stuff. 20 tenths in 2 ephot, okay, because again, each ephah is 10 tenths. So you have 20 isronot. That's, okay, why are we talking about this in 20? Because we want to divide this 20 in half, because azara lechametz v'azara lematzah. That's how the Thanksgiving offer worked. 10 of the esronot, of the tenths, meaning 1 ephah's worth, okay, in simpler terms, instead of talking about in tenths, 10 went to the chametz offerings, the chametz loaves, 10 went to the matzah loaves, the unleavened ones, ובמצה 3 מינים, חלות, רקיקים ורבוחה. Okay, don't be confused, challah doesn't mean challah, but challah, halot, rikikin, and revucha, there were these 3 types of ways of making it, okay? If you don't, we'll get to, when we learn in Menachot, we'll talk about all this, and as I mentioned different times, there's a place you can go and actually bake the breads of the Beit HaMikdash, and then you'll understand this much better. You'll see this 40 loaves, how big they were also. It was a crazy amount of bread. It also had to be eaten by the next day. So people had to share their korban todah offering, which is always a nice idea about it, that when you're giving a Thanksgiving offering, which is this voluntary offering that you bring at Thanksgiving for something that happened to you, that you were saved from something. There's 4 different things, reason why you would bring it. Anyway, putting all that aside, you had to include a lot of people in your celebration. That's why people do, a Seudat Hodaya nowadays. It's really based on that. Okay, so now getting back to our thing, we have half is used for the chametz and half, which are 10 loaves, half is used for the 30 loaves. So it's obvious math, right? Every chametz loaf is 3 times the size of the matzah, the unleavened loaves. So what do we see now? When it said that in Nechemia they brought, this was all to teach you, when they brought the todot gedolot, what they mean is the chametz loaves. Okay, that's what they want to tell you. So we bring these loaves of chametz. I told you there's another time we bring chametz. We're going to get to that soon. That's Shevuot. Okay, there was shtei halechem. It was a mincha offering they would bring with the kivsei atzeret. There was a special sacrifice of kasim that they would bring, and they would bring with it these 2 loaves called the shtei halechem. It's the only other chametz they bring in the temple. So now comes Rami Bar Chama. So this was really how you use the todot. You bring them as part of your procession when you're adding on to the borders of Jerusalem. You're expanding the sanctified borders of Jerusalem. Okay, which parts are going to be sanctified? Within this procession, you have the 2 Thanksgiving loaves. I'm a Rami Bar Chama. Now remember, we talked in the Mishnah of when you're mosif on Jerusalem and you're mosif on the azara. The azara is right the part in the temple where the altar sits, and then in there is the echal. And let's say you want to expand the borders of that. Now, what's the azara is used for, the sacrifices, obviously. That's where they would slaughter them. It's where they would sacrifice them. However, it was also all kachim had to be eaten in that area. Okay, so like there's all sorts of, for example, we're going to talk about soon, the shirayim of the mincha offerings were given to the kohen. Maybe extra parts of that. Or a chatat, the meat of the chatat goes to the kohanim. They have to eat it in the azara. Those are kachim. As opposed to, let's say, kochim kalim, like the meat of the shlamim offering, which if I bring a shlamim offering, I go eat the meat, and then I would do that. That has to be in Jerusalem. Those are called kochim kalim, and that's why the border of Jerusalem is important to know for all the kochim kalim or maser sheni. So now comes Rami Bar Chama and says, "Ein azara mitkadeshet ela b'shayarei mincha." The azara is only sanctified by what? Not lachmei todah. Okay, lachmei todah is for Jerusalem, as the remainders of the mincha offering, which go to the kohanim for the azara. My time. What's the reason? Well, ki Yerushalayim. As I just said, it's like an analogy. Ma Yerushalayim davar ne'achal b'mikacha. Just like Jerusalem, something that's eaten within the walls of Jerusalem, like the lachmei todah, is what sanctifies it, because lachmei todah are also kochim kalim. Af azara davar ne'achal b'mikacha. Also, in the azara, it has to be something that's eaten in the azara. So now they say, wait, something in your wording didn't really work, because also the lachmei todah can be in the azara. So why didn't they use the todah also for the azara? Because think about it. They have to be eaten in Jerusalem. They can also be eaten in the azara. So obviously they're going to fix this and say, okay, what they really meant to say was, Ela ki Yerushalayim, ma Yerushalayim davar ne'achaba v'yotzei mimena nifsal. What we meant is, something that can only be eaten in Jerusalem and can't be taken out of Jerusalem is what we use to expand the borders of Jerusalem, which would be the lachmei todah kochim kalim, which can't be eaten outside Jerusalem. Likewise, in the azara, af azara davar ne'achaba v'yotzei mimena nifsal. It's something that can be eaten in the azara and can't go out of the azara. So of course, lachmei todah can be in the azara as well, but they can also be eaten outside the azara. So what we're looking for is we're gonna in this ceremony that we're doing to expand the walls of the borders of the azara, okay, just like in the ceremony to expand the borders of Jerusalem, you have to use an item that can only be eaten in that area. And if it's taken out of that area, it will be disqualified. And that's why it's breads of the todah in Jerusalem and the remainders of the mincha in the azara. Okay, that's how we expand in the ceremony for expanding the borders of the azara. They would use the remainder of the mincha. Notice that, the Mishnah was talking about Jerusalem. And that's what Rami Bar Chama is saying, but you don't use lachmei todah in the ceremony to expand the borders of the azara. And now comes a question, which is we'll deal with for a little while. If you're comparing them and saying they're the same or analogous, Well, then, imal alan chametz, afkan chametz. Maybe then the shayrei mincha that you use should be chametz ones. Okay? Maybe, right? If the lachmei todav, specifically we said it's the chametz ones, then maybe it should also be chametz for the azara. Because if you're really comparing them, compare them all the way. So the Gemara says, which we know they're not. So, right, most shayrei mincha are not, because we just said there are no mincha offerings that are chametz other than the shtei halechem. So they now say, B'tizbara, minchat chametz mi'ika. So they say, why would you even think that? There is no minchat chametz. Okay, turning now to Amabet. Maybe you take the remainder of the mincha. Okay, the mincha can't be chametz. But maybe you take the remainder and you leave it to leaven, right? You could do that. You could leave it longer and it'll eventually leaven. So why don't we do that? In other words, if we're going to say, do it the same as the Todah, so let's do it exactly the same and make it chametz. So we could do that by taking the mincha remainder and letting it leaven. But no, haktiv lo te'afeh chametz chalkam. Okay, it says about the mincha offerings, don't bake them as chametz. There's this strange word chalkam. It could be like part of them. We don't know what that word means really, or their portion, unclear. Rish Lakish starts at that pasuk and says, "Afilu chelkam lo te'afeh chametz." Even a part of the mincha offering can be chametz. So you can't say, "Let's take the remainder and let's turn it into a leavened bread," okay, and use that for our procession. Okay. So now they say, "Alama lo." But still, why do you think you can't have a mincha offering? We mentioned before the shtei halechem. So, I mean, the Gemara didn't. I mentioned it too, but now the Gemara is going to suggest it. Efshar d'mekadosh b'shtei halechem ba'atzeret. Why don't we say, okay, now the shtei halechem is a special sacrifice for Shevuot. So now they're going to say, why don't we say that? If it has to be like the way we do Jerusalem, it needs to be with leaven, something. Well, the only leaven mincha offering we have is the atzeret, right? The on atzeret, on Shavuot, the shtei halechem. So let's say that any expansion of the azara has to happen on Shavuot, and use the two lechamim, the shtei halechem, use them in your procession, right? And then do with them, whatever. But why don't we use that as part of the procession? The Gemara says, Mishum de lo efshar, because it's not possible. Now they're going to bring 5 possible ways this could be done and reject each one of them. And that's what we're going to say at the end. There's no possible way to pull this off. Okay, why? Well, nivnei me'etmol, v'nekadsheh me'etmol. Well, let's say, okay, we don't want to build the Beit HaMikdash and add to the azara on Yom Tov. So let's do it all Erev Yom Tov. Let's do the building, right? Finish building the azara on Erev Yom Tov, Erev Shavuot. Then Nikdasheh Me'etmol, take the shtei halechem, do the procession with them. But what's the problem? Well, you need shtei halechem, which are sanctified. Now, when do they become sanctified? Well, now we're going to learn a halacha. Shtei halechem b'shchitat kvasim hu dekadshe. You take these kvasim, these sheep, for the Shavuot offering, and when you slaughter them, which you do when? On Shavuot, you always slaughter them on the day you sacrifice them. At the moment of, as you have these 2 breads you prepared, but they're only consecrated when you slaughter the animals, which only happens on Shavuot. So you can't do it Erev Shavuot, because we're obviously only going to do it with 2 breads that are sanctified for the shtei halechem, and that only happens on the holiday. So that's not possible. Okay, so how obvious would be nivnei me'etmol, option 2. Build the azara yesterday, right, the day before. And on the holiday of Shavuot, we'll do this whole procession to consecrate this area. Be'inan kiddush b'shat binyan. No, because there's a rule, I don't know where it comes from, but that when you do the sanctification of this, adding on this area, it has to be the same day you finish the building. Okay, so you have to, it's like doing a siyum, right? You can do a siyum. Maybe you could like finish almost until the last 2 lines, but at the siyum, you're going to finish the last 2 lines. So you can at least finish the building on that day. Well, right, what's the problem? Right, so you can't do it yesterday on Erev Yantif because that has to be done, the building, on the same day as the sacrifice. Sacrifice can't be, right, the shtei halechem can't be consecrated until Chag, so you're stuck. Third option, obvious, nivnei b'Yom Tov. So let's build it on Yom Tov, and consecrate it on Yom Tov, and that would be perfect. What's the problem? Obviously, ein binyan mikdash tochei Yom Tov. Okay, they don't say it's forbidden to build on Yom Tov. We know that. But maybe you would think for the purposes of a higher, there's all sorts of things that are overridden for the temple, but no. Building of the temple does not override Yom Tov. Okay, so we can't do it like that. Okay, option 4. We're not left with too many options anymore. Nish b'kalabatar hachi v'nivnei v'nikadshe. Why don't we just leave it till after Yom Tov? So we have the she'alechem from Shavuot. Leave them. Okay, let's hold them on the side. The next day, finish the building, vinikache, and then use the bread from yesterday, right? We can't use the bread before because it's not consecrated yet. But why don't we just use the bread from yesterday, right? So do it the day after Shavuot. If Belina, what do we know? Anything that gets consecrated, by the time the night passes, it becomes disqualified, right? And it has to be used on that day. Once it passes that through the whole night, it becomes disqualified. So that's not going to work. So the only last option is Nivniemi Male Yoma Unishaya Porta. So build it all on Erev Yom Tov, but leave a little bit over. Now we said, what happens with the bread? The bread gets disqualified once it passes through the nighttime on Shavuot, after Shavuot. So why don't you do this? Ad Kaddish Yom, as soon as Yom Tov is over, La'alter Nigmare, immediately after, finish whatever you left over, like leave over just some little symbolic thing to build. Finish that, Nikadshe, and then consecrate it. Do the whole ceremony with the Shtei Alechem, which is not disqualified yet because it was from that day. However, what's the problem? You're not allowed to build the temple at night, so you won't be able to even do that little bit because that's called building the temple, and you're not allowed to do that at night. How do we know this? The Amar Abaye, back to our comparison to Moshe and the Mishkan. How do you know you can't build the Beit HaMikdash at night? Shneimau ubiyom hakim et Mishkan. On the day that they put up the Mishkan. Biyom mikimo balayla ein mikimo hilkach lo efshar. So you can only do it in the day. You can't do it at night. And from there, we learned there's no way you could have used the chametz offering. So even though, okay, where did this all start? We compared, just like in Jerusalem, they used food that can only be eaten in Jerusalem and can't be taken out of Jerusalem. Also in the procession for adding to the azara, they used a food, this is what Rami Bar Chama said, they used a food which is the remainder of mincha offerings. That's what they used in the procession to add on to the azarot. But if we're already learning it from Jerusalem, why don't we learn that it's chametz, just like, right, remember, bringing chametz was a very unique thing. Generally, you didn't do that. But if they did that for the procession for Jerusalem, maybe the mincha offering should be chametz. But they said, number one, you can't take the shirei mincha and leaven them. That's forbidden. And number two, you can't take the shtei alechem because there's no way that you'd be able to use the shtei alechem on a day that wasn't holiday, right? And we tried all the possibilities, but no possibility worked. And that's because the building and the consecration have to happen all on the same day. Okay, now we move on to the next part, Bashir. They would sing. So what kind of singing and with what kind of musical instruments? Well, Tanu Rabbanan, Shir Shel Todah, that's Mizmor LeTodah. Okay, you see this whole element of thanks in here, right? We have the thanks, we use bread from a Thanksgiving offering. We use songs of Thanksgiving, the Mizmor LeTodah. B'kinorot, b'nevalim, u'b'tzaltzalim, harps, lyres, cymbals. I'll call Pinau Pinav, I'll call Evin Dolash Yerushalayim. You can imagine, right? This beautiful scene. There's musical instruments in every corner of Jerusalem and every stone of Jerusalem, right? There's everywhere. There's singing and musical instruments. Ve'omer, so they would say Mizmor LeTodah, and then they would add a bunch of other Mizmorei Tehillim. Ve'omer Arumim Chashem Ki Dilitani, and we'll go through each one and say why we do it. I will praise God because He took me out of the depths. And this is Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. Now, Chanukat Habayit is the consecration of the house. So obviously that's the one we're going to read now. And Shir Shel Pga'im v'Yeshomrim Shir Shel Niga'im. And the Shir of Pga'im are like things that attack us, or Shir of Niga'im, like a nega tzara, like a plague. Okay? Now, they're both referring to the same Perek Tehillim, which is Tehillim Tzadi Aleph. Okay, Mizmor LeTodah is Tehillim Perek Kuf. Right, it's like 9 chapters later. Tzadi Aleph is Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon B'Tzel Shaddai Yilonan. Okay, now, why this one particularly, and why is it called Shir Shel Pga'im and Shir Shel Niga'im? So first we'll see that, and then we'll explain why we read it specifically at the ceremony. Manda Amar Niga'im Dichtiv, because Pasuk Yud there says, V'nega lo yikra bo alecha. You shouldn't have any plagues in your tents, and therefore they call it the Shir of plagues. Of plagues. Umand Amar Pga'im, one who says Peka'im, which is more like evil spirits and things like that attacking you. Dichtiv Yipol mitzidcha elef, another pasuk in there. Yipol mitzidcha elef, 1,000 should fall from your side. Rivavot miminecha, right? And from the right, rivavot, right? Tens of thousands. So basically, these are tens of thousands and thousands. They're talking about specifically all sorts of evil spirits, right? This will ward off, right? God should ward off all the evil spirits. Okay, why do we say this? So Rashi explains, okay, I'm going to read Rashi, Shiur shel Peka'im yoshev b'seter elyon, ulefisha amro Moshe ba'akamat mishkan. Oh, wait. According to our tradition, Moshe said this parak Tehillim, this psalm, when he put up the Mishkan. How do we know this? Dichtiv, vayivarech otam Moshe. In Sefer Shmot, it says, with the building of the putting up of the Mishkan, it says at this, when Moshe consecrated, it said he blessed them. Now, the assumption is, Ma bercha, what did he bless them? Yihi ratzon sheshresh shechina b'maseh yedechem, right? The obvious bracha, that the Shechina should dwell in your midst, in your action, in what you do, and when you're creative, things you create. V'hi noam Hashem Elokeinu aleinu, and the noam Hashem should be upon you. That's from that parak of Tehillim. And why else do they think so? Well, hachita b'Torah Kohanim, that's a midrash in the midrash halachat Torah Kohanim. V'hume echad esar mizmorim she'amar Moshe b'sefer Tehillim mitfilah l'Moshe ad sof mizmor l'Torah. That's why I told you which parak Tehillim. These are 10 mizmorei Tehillim that Moshe said 11 from Tehillim Tzadi, and this is Tzadi Aleph, until Kuf. They attribute those all to Moshe because Tzadi is Tfilah Moshe. And because of that, they assume this is said by Moshe, and all the others through Moshe were said by Moshe, and they attribute them having said to Moshe, that Moshe said them, that the Yoshev Sefer Yom was the one that Moshe said at the dedication of the tabernacle, and that's why we read it. Now, then the Gemara says, which really only works with one of the opinions, Ve'omil, which part? We don't actually read the whole Yoshev Sefer Elyon. Yoshev Sefer Elyon b'tzel Shaddai Elonad ad ki ata Hashem machsi el yom samta mo'necha. Okay, that you are our abode, right? You kind of put us el yom samta mo'necha. You put our place, right? Your place to live is above. Anyway, until that pasuk. Now, what's strange about this? Well, if you say nigaim, okay, Peka'im works because Peka'im is chapter, the verse of the Pega, Yipol mitzidcha elef, is pasuk Zayin in that chapter. But pasuk Yud is actually outside of the realm of this section, and therefore it's a bit of a problem because you're missing the important pasuk. So they say that this part really only goes with if you say it's Shiur shel Peka'im and not Shiur shel Nigaim. And then they say, right, Becky, you're pointing out that's right. I forgot that the Yoshev B'Seiter, the V'hi Noam is actually the pasuk before. It's from the chapter, the end of the previous chapter. Okay, so now B'Chozer V'Omer, now we say another Mizmor L'Teilim, Mizmor L'David B'Barcho Mipnei Avshalom Beno, Hashem Marabut Sarai, Ad LaHashem Yeshua Alam Chabercha Tachasel. Then we say another Mizmor Tehillim about when David ran away from Avshalom, and it said, God Marabut Sarai, all right, all my woes, right, I have all these problems. And then in the end, it says, Hashem Yeshua. God has the way, right? The key to salvation is God. Why do we read this one? So Rashi helps us. V'omer Hashem Rabut Sarai in Rashi. Lefi shene'amar bo rabim omrim lenafshi ein yeshuata lo be'elohim selah. It says a lot of people in that chapter. It says a lot of people say that God is not going to save you because people were mitlotzim b'sarei Yehuda b'yamin shayu b'nei Yisrael b'nei Agola bonim et hachoma. Specifically, and this is relevant, when they were building the Choma of Jerusalem in Nechemia's time, people would mock them and say, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And this Tehillim references that. And there's a pasuk that sounds like it's referencing that, and therefore they would say that as well. Okay, so that was all which Pirkei Tehillim we say, right? It's obvious when we say songs, we mean Tehillim, and then which Tehillim do we say and why? Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, now we're going to have an aside. This Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi would say, Amar lehu lahani cry v'gane. He would read those psukim and go to sleep. Okay, he would read them before he went to bed. And this is, by the way, the source for Kriyat Shema L'Mitah, right? There's different elements of Kriyat Shema L'Mitah. One of them that we say Kriyat Shema before bedtime, there's a whole section of prayers people say, and one of them is Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon. And that comes from here. He would say it before he goes to bed. And why would he do it? To protect him from, right, evil spirits. People were always scared when they went to sleep at night. That's most of Kriyat Shema Lamita is conglomeration of things that are put together because to protect people from the night evils and give people strength before they go to bed. So Hechi Avid Hachi, right? Number one, they were worried about evil spirits. Number two, robbers and things like that. People who go around at nighttime. Hechi Avid Hachi. Okay, and again, remember, in the time when there were no street lamps or anything else, you could see why it was much scarier even than it is now. So how could we do this? How did he do this? He himself said, Asur litrapot b'divrei Torah. You're not allowed to use psukim for curing yourself. So that's kind of like what he's doing. Say lahagen shani. There's a difference between reading psukim to protect you, which people do all the time, refuah shlema for people, they say Tehillim, and for all sorts of things. You can do that for protection, not for healing from wounds. Okay, and this is like when you say Tehillim for a sick person, don't think that through reading these psukim you're trying to heal the person. It's not. Right? You're not doing a healing process. You're just protecting. The ela ki amar asul. Okay, now wait a minute. I'm going to ask something about this Rabbi Shimon Levi's statement. Asur litrapot b'divrei Torah. Asur di kamakan. And when you said you can't do it, it's when you have some wound, you can't start reciting Tehillim on the wound. But idi kamaka asur betula. Wait, it's just forbidden and not more than that. Hadran. It said, and we learned this in Hadran, Perak Chelek. Halochesh alamakan en lochelek l'olam haba. It's way worse than just forbidden. You don't get a portion of the world to come if you do this. So they say. You might remember this. If you spit on your wound, which people obviously did, and then recited psukim, that is forbidden because then you're not going to get a portion of olam haba because you're like spitting and then using the name of God. That's really disrespectful. Okay, but just reading psukim to be healed, that's only forbidden. Okay, it's also forbidden, but it's not going to be like you're going to lose your portion of olam haba. Now, I just want to point out, you can read this, the Rambam in Hilchot Avodat Kochavim, chapter 11, halacha 12, talks about what's wrong with this. It's a super interesting topic. And he basically says, first of all, he says you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't read psukim to a tinok so he won't be scared. You shouldn't put a sefer Torah or tefillim on a child when they're sleeping. People would do this, okay? Very interesting, right? Otherwise, why would he tell you can't do it? People weren't doing it, okay, in order to help them sleep. Lo dai shehem bichlam min hachashim b'chovrim. He looks at this as witchcraft. Using psukim to heal someone, that's like witchcraft. That's spells, right? But in addition, he says, you're also kofrim b'Torah, because he says you're doing divrei Torah l'refuat haguf, and they really meant l'refuat hanefesh. So psukim are for your soul, they're not for your body. Fascinating topic. Anyway, we don't have time, but just wanted to read that to you. Okay, last part for today. Beitim malachim v'shtei todot acharihim. So it sounds like the beitin goes first, and then the todot after them. Remember, debating coming toda. Wait, sounds like the beitin goes first. Aktiv, it says in the psukim, if you were going by Nechemia, what does it say? Vayelech acharehem Moshe v'chatzi sarei Yehuda. It says after the bread went the important people. So hachi kamer. So they say, fine, read this line differently. Beitim alchim ushtei todot malchot. Okay, the beitin goes in the procession, as do the two lachmei todah. But beitin acharehem. But the court is behind them. Okay, in other words, it mentioned the beitin first. But then it tells you, oh, but the beitin's in the back. Now, Ketzav Malcho. How did the two breads walk? Okay, obviously the two breads don't walk. Someone's carrying them, right? But how did the people carrying them walk? Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe, we're going to have a machlokah, and then we're going to try to think. Number one, explain what's the pnimin, the chitzoni, according to each of these opinions, and then we're going to try to maybe prove one over the other, that one is right and one is wrong, but we won't be able to do that. We're going to reject that, and that's where we're going to end today. Chanamar zo keneged zo. One said two opposite each other, meaning parallel, they're walking together. One after the other. Okay, those are basically the two options. The one who says together, next to each other, what's the pnimit then? The inner and the outer? The pnimit is the one that's near the wall. Okay, the wall of Jerusalem, right? We're going to expand the wall now, but the one that's walking closest to the wall that exists right now, right? That's the one. Manda amar zo achar zo, the one who says after the other, the pnimit is hadam mekarba lebeitin. The inner one is the one that's closer to the procession of the beitin that's walking behind them. So it's the second one. So now they say, okay, but wait a minute. Let's try to figure out which one's more right. Because look at the Mishnah. Now, why is one eaten and one burned? Again, burned usually means it's disqualified and therefore you have to burn it. It's something sanctified that's disqualified has to be burned. If you say one was after the other, we can see why the inner one which is the back one, is eaten and the first one is burned. Why? Well, they're coming from in Jerusalem and they're going outside Jerusalem to expand the borders. So now they say, the first one went out. And when the first one goes out, what does it do? First of all, it gets disqualified because it left the borders of the city and you haven't yet sanctified it. So that's why it gets burned. But then as soon as it goes out, the outside part is already consecrated. So when the second one comes out, right? So that one goes first, it sanctifies it. And therefore, when the second one comes out, it's already in Jerusalem still, because even though it's outside the original border, the border's been expanded. But if they both go out at the same time next to each other in parallel, when they both consecrate at the same time, and either you say, well, was he yet consecrated when they went out, so they're apostle and they both should be burned, or you say they consecrated as they go, and therefore they're both eaten. That doesn't make any sense. So it seems like Zoach Harzo is the right answer. To which the Gemara responds, according to what you're saying, I have a problem with the Zoach Harzo also. Why'd you come up with this idea that one bread went out and it already consecrated? What does it say? In order to consecrate the prop, right, that expansion, what do you need to do? You need 2 loaves, right? And you have to do b'chol elu, right? You have to do it in all these things, all these ways. It says if it wasn't done in this way, it's not consecrated. So you didn't bring 2 out, it shouldn't be consecrated at all. Even if you say, which we're going to see there's been machloket in tomorrow's daf, that only one of these could be enough to consecrate, these are both one mitzvah. Then the 2 count as really one, the 2 todot are one of the things that are needed. So Elam Rabbi Yochanan. So now we're going to say, obviously, the whole one is burnt, one is eaten, has nothing to do with this. Therefore, how did they explain it? Just because the Navi told us this. And that's what they're saying is it must be in the time of Nechemia, the Nevi'im that were still there, those were the last Nevi'im, Chagai, Tzchariah, Malachi, were there and they said this is what's supposed to be. And we don't understand it at all. Okay, we have no logical explanation, but that must be the only explanation, like we say, tradition. Okay, before I finish, I just want to mention that Alana Steinhain Shiur went up yesterday about a time, and this is really connected with tomorrow's daf, about time when they tried to do sacrifices in the 1800s in Jerusalem, where they tried to raise the issue, can sacrifices be done? A fascinating historical piece, also somewhat based on the Gemara, really, really interesting, so I recommend you listen. Okay, so what we do, we started with this v'chein ta'asu, the way they did in Moshe is the way we do it, and that explained the first part of the Mishnah of all things have to be there. We had a bit of a question, what about the avodatam mechanach, what about the klei shaveit? We dealt with that as a side, all sorts of drashot in the pasuk. Then we talked about the 2 todot, and we learned from that part from Nechemia, the todot, the shiur, all that comes from Nechemia, and we learned it has to be bread, specifically leavened bread, and not the matzah offerings. From there, Rami Brahama said in the azara, the comparison is the shayrei todah, the shayrei mincha, and then we had a question, maybe it should also be chametz. That can't be possible, so we said no. Then we finished with the shiur, which songs did they sing, which psalms did they sing, and then the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi actually took one of those and would say them every night to protect. How does that work with you can't use them for a cure? Got into that. And then we finished with this, how the procession worked. And number one, where was the beit? And they were behind. And then how did the 2 todot, how were they carried one next to the other or one in front of the other? That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Lag BaOmer Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom and Besorot Tovot.